Yeah, so poppy field. So I've actually done this a couple of times. I don't know if you can see that on there. If move my head out of the way. So I've done this a couple of times on a few different surfaces. I had a bit of a play around. So I was just saying that I went out and I took some photos of this field, and cameras. My smartphone is actually quite a good one, but it doesn't quite capture the feeling of being there. And I think that's sometimes where these drawings and art comes in. Not only do you get the memories back when you're actually drawing it, but you can emphasize certain things, you can make certain things pop. So I had a bit of a play around with doing that, and I'm not saying it was the easiest thing to do with the poppies, and I'll show you some tricks for what I learned from that process. So hopefully, I did budget sort of an hour and a half for this session. We'll see how my voice holds up, but we're definitely good for an hour, she says, famous last words. But I'll certainly leave you with lots of different techniques to try. So you can see all my sort of doodles, and I'll explain what all of these are as we sort of go along. So this one I did was on Rising Museum board. You can see it's a board and it's quite stiff. So it was an offshoot that I had from another piece. So I had a play around with that. And then I did a second piece on I think this is a Bristol Vellum, the 400. Again, it was a spare, you can see it's quite small, a spare piece of paper that I had of drawing a cat paw on the other side of that. My point being, you use these techniques across different surfaces, and the way I know that is because I tried it across lots of different surfaces. Today I'm going to be working on arches for the main reason. So I've got it's not one I use regularly. I do actually quite like it. It's growing on me an awful lot. I'm not a huge hot press person normally, but I think working on hot press paper has made me a far better colour pencil artist, because I have to think a little bit more when I'm working on a surface like this, and some of the papers with a little bit more texture. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But whatever paper you've got, it's fine. I'm going to swap my view. So this is our reference photo. The colours that I think are going to be really useful for this session, similar approach to we've done before with these backgrounds. So if I bring in this test piece, you'll see that I've move that out of the way so you can see that a little bit better. Yeah, so I've faded off the horizon a little bit because that gives us more depth in that horizon there. So the similar sort of pencils we had in that very first session, if you were able to join me with that one. So that ultramarine violet or a violety colour is going to be really useful there. Maybe something like a cobalt blue. That works really nicely for the sky. So you can be working on those. We'll probably start there and have a little bit of a refresher with that, just so I can get a feel for the paper again. And then we're looking for those. I've got my little pot here, you can see, with all these pencils in it. So what I'd call my duller greeny pencils, so something like a green earth or an earth green. This is a middle verdigris, which is a lovely pencil. Something with a bit of a pop, more of a pop. So sometimes I use a spring green just to give it a little bit of a, if you've got sunlight sort of shining on it, you can have something like that. Or if you're not quite so bold, something like a khaki green. And then I've been using either a chromium green opaque or chrome oxide green, something like that, so a darker green. So let's say five greens or so, and then we'll use the same greens down here in the in this area as well, where we've got the poppies. But our main decision is going to be around what kind of red to use. So I gave you a little hint on that in the email, if you've read the email that I sent. Talked a little bit, and I did some swatches when I did my first version here, and you can see I've got quite a few different reds here. I basically grabbed all the reds that I owned and tested out a few to decide what I wanted to do with these poppies. So, and I think that's a really useful approach to actually choosing one of those colours. And hopefully it's coming across on the screen that this light cadmium red, for example, in the polychromos, that leans more orange. So I can see more yellowy tones in it. Certainly if you compare it to this other end down here, which is more of a cherry colour. I don't even have those pencils out because I sort of discounted those ones quite early. And then in the middle, you've got some of your more classic reds. So on one end, we're closer towards purple, and on the other end, we're closer towards orange and yellow tones. Now, in terms of what the best one is for the photo, my instinct is to say, go with your gut feeling on this. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do this. The reason why I don't think there's a right or wrong way is because I've looked at this photo so many times and I can see so many different versions of red in this photo. I think overall, though, it's given me an impression of yellow. So if you kind of close your eyes, half close your eyes a little bit, I think especially with having the green in the field as well, it's a bright summer's morning. We've got the sun coming from this direction here. You can't tell really what direction the sun's coming from, other than looking at some of these trees in the background. The poppies don't really give it away. So having looking at some of those trees, it's rising in the sky. I know that it was early morning, so I know that the sun was quite low and it's sort of coming in from that direction. But it feels very warm, this photo. Some of the greens down here closer to us are a little bit cooler, but there's really a haze of sort of yellow in there. So I think having a more, even a more yellowy red or orangey red is going to be okay. My advice is to choose something in the middle. So something like a Derwent red, that's the light fast one, or that's a Scarlet. Again, it's the light fast one. I think this is permanent red, that one there, in the luminance. It doesn't matter too much. What I wouldn't choose necessarily is something too sort of cherry coloured, something too purpley, because I think we want to give it sort of a summery yellowy glow. Now, if you zoom in on some of these poppies, and if you've ever held a poppy, you'll know that they're varying in colour. And I would probably say that they're actually a little bit cooler. They're actually a little bit more, in some cases, like this cherry red. But actually, if we imagine our poppy field, I think we're going to go for one of the more orangey reds. So have a little look around, have a little swatch, have a little play if you want to. I think I will go for, so this one I did in the permanent red, I think, with the luminance, and then the other one, this one I did in the Derwent red. And if we put them together, they're not hugely different, and you can see how much, it's quite useful to see how much these vary. This one took twice as long as this one. So I did spend more time fiddling around with this one, and I used harder pressure towards the end on this one. But you can see I've been playing around with where the clumps are. So I talked in the email as well about how we sort of map in these clumps. This one, I pushed that background. I got more depth in this background because I worked on it a little bit longer. So I did use those colours that I mentioned previously. So I did use my ultramarine violet. I also played around with a little bit of heather in there as well, just having a little bit of a mess around with it. Yeah, we'll get to these ones in a minute. Let's get drawing, shall we? Let's get drawing. So got my little border here. Another thing that I was going to say with these little pieces is I meant for them to be little so that we could cover quite a lot in a short amount of time and it didn't become too overwhelming. And I think what I've inadvertently done is actually made it a little bit more difficult because we're working at such a small scale, that actually if you wanted to do the detail of these poppies, what you'd actually do is you'd do it at a much so the poppies are a lot bigger. You make it a lot easier for yourself. There is value though in zooming out and just getting a general impression of that landscape, and that's what we're aiming for. But if you wanted to just draw a poppy field, say you were doing this as a commission or a big project, I would definitely make it a lot bigger. What we're doing is working on miniature pieces, and actually it can become quite challenging doing it that way. I'm going to move my phone out of the way because it alters the colours on the screen because the camera starts adjusting. Right, let's get drawing. I'm going to go in. So it's quite a pale horizon at the bottom there. I'm going to choose a yellowy colour. So that's one of the colours I didn't just mention. I was talking about 20 different colours and I didn't mention that one. So something yellowy. So this is a cream. I've got a yellow ochre. We might save that for a little bit later. It doesn't matter on the brand. Light yellow glaze. That's very yellowy. A cream isn't quite yellowy, but it's sort of warm. Something like that, or anything. So that's a Naples ochre, just something creamy yellowy, something quite warm. What we're going to do first, let me go with a polychromos cream. I'm just going to mark part way down, just a sort of horizon line here for the little mini trees to start. Doesn't, as we've spoken about before, it's kind of about there on mine. As we've spoken about before, it doesn't matter copying that reference photo exactly. You can make your trees bigger or smaller. And I find actually mapping them in with a earth green or something that shows up quite early on is quite helpful. So I'm holding my pencil relatively far back, just so I lose control a little bit on it. And I'm just going to sketch in roughly the shape of almost the top of some of those trees. I'm going to take out some of the features I want and leave some others. I've shifted one of those trees across a little bit. I'm not too worried about that. I just want a little bit of blue showing at the top, and then the rest I'm just going to pop in a few trees. So you will all, if you've followed along with all of these different little mini landscapes, you're all going to be experts at these mini trees, if nothing else, because we've done them now a few times. Okay, so our little mini trees, super light pressure, really far at the back there. I am going to bring in a lighter green, so something like the khaki, or if you've got a leaf green, you can pop that in. So more of a leafy green there, so almost like an emerald green, but a little bit more yellowy. And I'm just going to pop in, because there's a few sort of hedges at the front here, not quite trees, bushes. Bushes is the word I was looking for. A few sort of bushes there. Just pop those in. The other thing we've been doing with all of these, whether you've realised it or not, is we've been doing all of them freehand. We've been doing all of them without any sort of line art or more preparation going in, and it's just, you know, freeing us up a little bit, allowing ourselves to have a play. And that's one of the things that I'd recommend. A few people have sent me their little landscapes, and they're all wonderful. They're all individual, but I would say make sure with these that you push it. So this is time to get out a knife if you've never done it before and see what happens, especially if you've got quite a few sort of waxy layers down. If you wanted to add in that detail, if you wanted to bring in a bold sort of, you know, play with something like a Delft Blue, if you've never, those pencils that you never use in your set, this is the time to sort of bring those in. Have a play around with the clouds. I've got a cloud tutorial somewhere. If you've not got that, let me know and I'll whiz that over. I've picked up a light cobalt blue now, and I'm just mapping that sky in as well before I go any further with these little trees. I'm using light pressure. I can build this up later. This isn't going to be the focus of today's session, so I'm just popping this in really quickly. I'm making a decision on the fly. Sometimes I've included some of these clouds in and sometimes I've left them out. I'm going to leave a little bit of white on this side here. So I'm using sort of light pressure there, and I've done maybe a couple of layers really sort of quickly. Lovely. And then I'll go in, I think, with a white on top of these little mini trees. So if you are following along and you've done this before, then go quickly. You know, you've done this before, you know what you're doing, or you've tried it at least before. Just follow your instinct a little bit with it. So what I'm doing now is just popping a quick layer of the white on top. I've grabbed a Pablo white because I couldn't find any other whites. That's the only reason really. I don't tend to use a polychromos white. It doesn't really do an awful lot for me. The reason why I'm popping this white in mainly is to provide a little bit of a barrier. I'm using relatively light pressure and I've just gone over that. I've spoken about this before if you have joined me before. Say for example I put my earth green down without a barrier, it looks like that. If I put a white down first as a gentle layer, I can get a much paler colour with the same amount of pressure. So I find that that's quite helpful with producing these pale colours. Another way to do that is to just jump to a paler colour. So if you do have the middle third degree, you can jump straight to that. What I'm effectively trying to do is create that for those people that might not have that in their sets, and also show different methods for sort of show other methods for, you know, creating those colours. So putting that white down, I do that quite a lot when I've got a dark colour that's sort of it's perfect colour but it's the wrong value. So I'll do that quite a lot. Now I've noticed I'm holding the pencil now towards the front, but I'm using a really shallow angle. It's giving me a little bit more control on here. I don't really know why I'm doing it that way rather than holding it back. I think I feel, because the pencil's getting a little bit smaller, I feel like it sits in my hand a little bit better if I'm doing it like this. So got some little trees in there. They're coming along quite nicely. I might pop in the purple now. If you have been following along with this, you might be thinking, oh, that's not the same order that I've done this in before. I thought we'd go in with a different colour next. And that's because I don't really have a set way of doing things. You know, there's no formula. I'm just sort of following what what is happening on the paper and what I feel like doing. The purple tones are pushing the background, these trees further into the background. So I do like having the purple tones in there, but it might be that on another drawing I'll add those in later. It's looking, to be honest, this end, it's looking really messy. Okay, it's looking really messy, but that's fine. That's part of the process. And I am working relatively quickly. I'm just sort of sketching in some blobs of colour at the moment. I've intentionally left some more yellowy bits in there for where the light's hitting. I'm grabbing a darker green now, and I'm just going to adjust those values quite quickly. Now this green, as it's going down, you'll either see it live, or certainly if you watch the recording back, you'll see that it's quite an evergreeny green, and it's actually sitting quite vivid. It is dark, but it's definitely giving us a pop of definite colour, and I don't like that. Not for this pushed back background. I'm thinking as I'm putting this down that that's the right value almost. It's the right depth of colour, and I've got a nice variation now in my lights and darks across here. But for actually getting the feel of that landscape that I want, I want to push that back. So I want to come in now with maybe a dark indigo or a Payne's grey. It's my dark indigo. So that's just going to darken it off a little bit further. I'll just do a gentle layer on top. I'm holding it far back and I'm being quite sort of sketchy with it. And then I'm thinking, no, actually, I need to dull it down, and then also I want to make it a little bit lighter as well. I almost wanted them sort of satin mist. So if we bring over this one, sort of satin a bit of mist. So that's when I might bring back my purple. So my ultramarine violet, and just go over the top there, or I might bring in my white first and do it that way. I've left some of these little bushes for the moment. I'll come back to those. But you can see that I've not been too precious about it. Some of these trees I'm varying my stroke as well. So some of these trees here, these ones here, are more, you can always see little, the shape of them, almost little V's, or you certainly see lines in them. Others of them there's a few sort of conifers there, others are bushier. So for the more conifer-like ones, I'm sort of doing little V's. I'm moving up like that, or I'm moving down to the sides. I'm just sort of doing it quite sort of sketchy. So that sort of motion of something, almost something in the middle, and then V's off to the side, and V's, and so you can create there we go. Super quick, sketchy. This might be a nice practice exercise. Super quick, sketchy trees at the back there. Okay, so that's a little bit of something there. It's not coming off. That's going to become part of my tree. There we go. Right, bottom of these bushes then. Let's move that off there. Bottom of those bushes. Those in, and we can revise and play with this background later, but that's a super quick background. Let's get to the poppies then. So how are we going to approach the poppies? My recommendation for the poppies is to put in a pale yellowy colour as an undercoat, a sort of a base layer. And particularly when we've got these almost banks of poppies at the back here. So if you squint your eyes on the reference photo, it feels quite yellowy. And the yellow actually, or the creamy colour here, it's going to sit all right next to my green. It's just going to make it another shade of green. It's just going to make it a little bit more of a yellowy green. Even with one of the more blue leaning or the cooler greens, it's still going to make a version of green. So it's not going to do any damage to those. I did have a play around with a few, and you can do this as well if you want to, have a play around with a few sort of almost base underlayers for these banks of poppies. The purple one worked quite nicely as well. So that was just taking that ultramarine violet, almost mapping it out really gently, and then popping on the reds on top of that. So if we take our red and then we pop on the reds on top of that, it changes the reds a little bit. It makes them a little bit more purple leaning, but it's not going to, they're still going to look like bright poppies. To keep them really vibrant though, I would do it on top of a yellowy, a more yellowy tone. It's also, I found from experience working over this extent here, to soften with a pale glaze was really nice. If you can read my writing there, soften with that really pale glaze. And by glaze I mean taking one of these other colours or even a white, and you just go on top of those poppies to just create almost that sort of flowy feel to the field itself. So that's what we're going to do. The other thing that I was experimenting with, and that's where these sort of circles come in, is the reason for having sort of that yellow halo there. When it sort of gives it, protects that red and gives it a nice sort of barrier against the green. So what you don't want is to have your reds and greens mixing together, because then you get a sort of brown and dark halo around everything, because they're two complementary colours. So say we've got our red and then we've got a very bright green. If you look at the tips, they will neutralise and create a brown or a really, really dark red, like a red in extreme shadow. And we don't want a shadow around all of our poppies like that. We want to keep them nice and bright. So actually having the yellow in there is going to work really well. So what we're going to do is we're going to pop in a few sort of waves of where we think our poppies are going to come. We're going to do this with the yellow. We're not going to worry too much about exactly where everything is. This is just a marker to help us make this as quick and as enjoyable as possible. We don't want to get too caught up with thinking about where each of those individual poppies are. I realise you can't see what I've done very clearly on the camera there, so I'm just going to do a doodle with a green on this side. So all I've done is I've just sort of made a few sort of shapes almost like this across the page. So I've got a few blocks where I think I'm going to put my poppies, and then when I get round to it, I'm going to put my poppies on top with little dots, and then we're going to go over the top and sort of smooth and glaze them back down again. But before we do that, I'm going to pop in some of the green banks as well. So some of those. So what we've done is we've taken our creamy colour, wherever I see sort of lines of poppies, I'm popping in those. So I'm popping in some shapes for those sort of lines of poppies. Between those, some bits of green, and we're just going to pop in some blobs of green as well. So we'll end up with, certainly for the first upper part of this field, we'll have yellow, this yellowy creamy colour everywhere, or we'll have a green colour everywhere. So I've got my earth green there. It's not ideal, that one. I might swap to permanent. If you've got a permanent green, that's quite handy as well. I might use that in a minute. I'm going to swap to the khaki just to start with, and I'm just going to pop in some of these grassy bits. I am doing this more in an upright motion, and then it's almost killing two birds with one stone. It's giving some texture to the field as well. Don't worry if you've not got 100% coverage, because we will come back and we'll fill that in as well. But move that phone out so that adjusts a little bit. So again, on my little sketch over here now, so I've got my sort of yellows in there. Now I'm coming in between those, and I'm just putting in some of those almost mid-tones of those greens. So putting in some of those greeny bits. And we're just going to come halfway down the field for now. See how we go with that. If you do have any questions, let me just scroll down and check the chat. If you do have any questions, do let me know. Just take a sip of water. Okay, so I'm going to come back in with my yellow now, my creamy colour. Just fill in some of those gaps a little bit. There. And then I'm going to start building up some of these greens a little bit more, I think. So something more of a leafy green. Hopefully you know what I mean by that, like a classic, your green. So on a colour wheel, what would the green be? So that's a leaf, that's a grass green. This one's slightly yellowy. It's a little bit more vibrant. It doesn't really matter. Something along those lines. I'm going to go for this bright green because it's a nice contrast with that bright red. Just popping. Oops. Sketchy bits in there. I am using light pressure, but because it's so dark and I haven't really got anything on the surface, it's coming out quite drastic there, not to mind. So yeah, what I was saying is the key really for these poppies, and the reason why we're doing it in these stages like this, is that we've got our red down there, and then we've got our green for our sort of grass, and then they meet and they mix. You're going to end up with a mucky colour in the middle. We don't want that. So what we want is we've got our grass, and then we've got our red poppy. What we're doing is creating a bit of a buffer. So we're creating a bit of a buffer with this creamy colour in the middle. So the worst that's going to happen to our red is that it's going to end up more of an orange, and the worst that's going to happen to our green is it's going to end up more of a vibrant yellowy green. What we're not going to get is this mixing in the middle. So we're putting down this safe colour, so you see this creamy colour, and it will work with different yellows as well. So this is a light yellow glaze, it's the same idea. It's still going to have the same effect, it's just giving us a safety zone so that those two colours aren't going to mix together. So in actual fact, I could do a whole wash, and you could do that with here if you wanted to. And that's what I meant about a glaze. I tend to do that sort of washing of those colours on later. The other thing that you could do, and we'll have a play around on this side, is actually, if you zoom right into this photo, there's some purple flowers in there. And to me, on this side, it's got a bit of a purple hue. And I certainly remember when I was there in the field that I could see some more of this purpley colour. So we can use that as more of a glaze on this side. But let's try on the other side, practicing that technique and getting some of these poppies in then. So we're going to be brave with one of our reds then. So one of your reds, what did I say I was going to use? I was going to use my Derwent red. And for simplicity's sake, I would use the same red throughout, but you could vary it. So you could have those at the back and a different red. And what I'm going to do is just pop in some little dots on the horizon there. And I'm going to do that all the way across. I'm being careful not to touch my greens, but otherwise I'm being quite generous with the sort of dots and poppies that I'm putting in quite a few. I'm just not trying not to touch any of the greens at the moment. So I did this before. As I say, I came back from the poppy field. My daughter was sort of saying, well, almost saying, I've had enough exercise for today, can I watch TV now? And I sort of thought, well, actually, well, not all day, but yes, you can watch some TV, and I'll just have a play around with some of these photos. So I started off like this, and it just felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. It felt really rough, and I didn't really enjoy doing it until I had a bit of a play around with some of these techniques and making it a little bit easier. So actually the size of the poppies in the background here, if I bring this back in again, they're very, very small. So in order to sort of get any oomph with it, I think it really is a case of finding something that you want to sort of blend it with. So I would try out a few. So you could try blending it and moving it around a little bit, and the effect will vary dependent on the paper that you've got and the pencils that you're using. But just have a play around and see if, say for a white, so that's going to be the easiest way to sort of blend that around. Again, you're just blending it in that safety zone. So in the area where you've got the white, in the area where you've got, so we'll have some cream, won't we? We'll put some cream or a yellowy colour down, and then we put a red down, we put some dots on the top, something like that. So in that sort of safety zone, not in the area underneath and around the sides where we've got these sort of greeny colours, but in that sort of safe zone, have a little play at sort of smudging it. I wouldn't use hard pressure because you can't go back from that, but just have a little play and see what happens when you sort of smudge it around. And then I would go back in again then when you've smudged it a little bit and put in a few more of those red dots and see if you're getting closer to that feeling that you're getting in the landscape. And it's a case of moving backwards and forwards really with that kind of technique. So again, in this little demonstration area here, I might then have a few more on top. Again, I know that I'm trying to get in that sort of dotted dappled texture, and now I've got different intensities of those reddy colours. Now for me, this isn't screaming out kind of that yellowy feeling that I really wanted to. So either swapping to something like the light cadmium red and actually mixing my reds up, or coming in back in with more of a creamy colour and sort of blending it a little bit. That might be giving me more of that feel of those poppies at the back there. So if you're coming across on that one a little bit. And then as we move forward, it actually becomes a little bit easier because our dots become easier, our poppies become a little bit more distinct. We get a little bit more confident in our technique. I would say start to think as you move forward. So as we're moving in this direction, you probably start off with a few sort of dots. Then you might move to sort of lines. And if we are thinking about the direction the sun's coming in, the sun is coming in from this direction here, or even a little bit lower, these poppies are going to be waking up and wanting to face the direction of the sun. So as they get bigger, they're sort of scooping around in that direction. And then when we get right close to us, you can get them more towards that kind of classic poppy shape. And then it's up to you how long you want to sort of spend drawing some of those individual poppies, but that's what I'd sort of do to get the depth in this piece. So at the back, to get our depth, we're going in with our ultramarine violet. So we're giving it a sort of a purple glaze there. If you want to knock that back, then again, it's your white on top of there. So I'm using a harder pressure now on that horizon line, and I'm just softening it. And that would be my recommendation for getting depth in some of these landscape pieces, is to think about that varying detail level. One of the ways to do that is to actually vary the size of your features. So think about those poppies are all the same size in reality, but as we're looking at the field itself, they're going to get bigger closer to us. It seems like it makes sense, but actually when you're drawing in the photo, the temptation is, because you zoom in so much, you're actually going to zoom in and see all these little poppy heads and think, I want to draw these guys at the back here, and then all of a sudden they become as big as the ones at the front, when we've actually got quite a difference. These are almost dots at the back here. So that as much as you can refrain from zooming in, the better. So we can vary our size as we move down, but I'd also vary sort of the intensity of the colour as well. So we've got our purple as a cheat for that. Having white on standby as well, even on those other layers, just as a bit of a glaze to pop things back. It's almost like it sits in the mist. And then once you've got it popped back, the trick is to then come in and darken little bits again, and it's a backwards and forwards until you've got the balance as you like it. But the same thing is going to happen with these poppies as well. So we're going to glaze the ones at the back. We're not going to do that so much at the front here. So we're going to glaze the ones at the back. White is going to be a safe glaze. And then we've talked about having something warm, like a cream or even an ivory. Those are going to be safe here. I wouldn't use those yellowy colours on the trees and the horizon, but they're going to be safe in our poppy field, because remember, they'll sit with either of those colours, with the red or the green. Or you can play around with something like a purple, so you could do a bit of a purple on some of these areas as well, and sort of push those back a little bit and give a little bit more interest. Again, interestingly, the purple doesn't, it sits all right with both the green and the red. It's going to work quite nicely with those. It's not going to adjust it a huge amount. It's just going to sit quite nicely with those colours as well. So you can play around with that, that sort of purple. And then it's just a case of sort of circling through. Now, one of the things that I was kind of feeling, because I think I was using this Derwent red, so this is my Derwent red here. So it's more of, I would say it's somewhere in the middle. So if you think about different reds as either having more orange in them, or having more of a sort of purple in them at the other end, then this Derwent red sits in somewhere in between. But it becomes, it's not quite giving me the feeling of that yellow field. Yeah, we sit those. I know this is a lot duller, but it's not quite giving me the feeling of being back there. So that's when I grab something like a yellow ochre. So this is a light fast, light yellow ochre in the. You see the difference between those. So that's a light yellow ochre in the polychromos. The yellow ochre in the light fast is slightly more yellowy, so I'm not sure what you'd want in a polychromos, but something that's a little bit, something yellowy, not bright like a yellow glaze. Naples yellow, that might be nice in a, okay, that's quite similar. So a Naples yellow in a polychromos is quite nice. Yeah, so something that's not, I wouldn't necessarily go with like a bright, could do, yeah. Second thinking. You could use a orangey yellow. So this is a dark cadmium yellow. What we don't want is like a greeny yellow, because that's not really going to help us. So that's a light yellow glaze. So something, something around that region. And then what I found was quite useful is, so let me take my Naples, is just going over some of these poppy heads a little bit, and again just kind of fading it off. So if I do that on this example here, I'm almost going around them a little bit and just sort of softening them off, blurring them a little bit, making them a little bit more orangey, a little bit warmer, and it's actually helping sit them within the field a little bit better. So let me do that on top of these bigger ones. So if we go on top of those, and I'd say the key to this is trusting yourself, that trusting the fact that it's going to look messy, but at the other end of it, it's going to give you what you want, and you're certainly learning something from it anyway. One question you might have is, well, why don't you go first in with the yellow? And to be honest, I've not got a solid answer for that. I think it just, I mean, you could reverse the process. So we went in, didn't we, with the cream first. I had the cream, I popped on a red, and now I'm going on with a yellow and sort of smushing it down, moving it around a little bit. What happens if we reverse that? Let's do a little experiment over here. So gone on top of, we're going with the yellow first of all, and then I blend that with the cream. I think you're getting the same effect. I think mentally I'm never ready to go in on a white piece of paper with a dark colour, a bold colour straight away. So it helps me to start off gentle, and then darken off and then mix. That seems that seems to work with my brain a little bit better. But there's no right or wrong rule with it. So at this point, I'm getting the feel now for those colours, and it's nice and soft, and I know it's heading in the direction that I want. I'm losing some of the definition on some of these poppies, so I could go in and sort of dab a few more in. I'm being a little bit more careful with them here. I don't want to go too careful in terms of not adding too many in at once. I'm just popping a few more in, and then what I would do is come in again with those greens. So I've still got quite a few gaps in there. So then it's a case of sort of coming in with one of my greens. So this is my khaki green, so that's more of a yellowy green. I'm just popping that in, going almost to the red, but not quite. I'm being quite careful not to mix with those reds in there. Coming down there. Got some white paper there. I'm going to fill that in with the cream for now. Soften that off a little bit. And then it's the same approach coming further down, except I wouldn't necessarily do big banks of colour. So what we did with our sort of pencils up here, so all of this bit is sort of this approach here. So we had sort of a big bit of yellow there, and then a bit of yellow, and then we started putting our poppies on top. Here I'd probably be a little bit more careful about where I'm putting my poppies. So I'd do more poppy heads. And actually, I think when I did this, I found the first time I did this, I actually went just straight in with my reds, just as I did over here. And I just started popping in some of those little head shapes, making them a little bit smaller as they go back. You might want to work in one direction or another rather than dotting backwards and forwards. It's however you want to do it. So if I bring this one back in, it might be clearer to see. So let's review some of those bits that we've been through then. So on this diagram here, as I said before, we're getting bigger. These poppy heads are getting bigger as we're moving closer to the camera. We're exaggerating what we're seeing in the field on that reference photos to get the feeling of being in that field. Started off with a pale kind of a pale colour, a yellowy colour to put in my bank of poppies. And then I started dotting on some poppy heads, blending a little bit with some yellow around the outside. So you can see here I did some sort of doodles around. I've made a note, vibrant yellow at the end. So especially on some of these ones here, you can see those sort of vibrant yellows at the top of the poppies. I felt that I wanted to give those poppies a bit of a halo to protect them, because I was getting this effect of them sort of getting this mixing colour of the greens and the reds. I did use on this one, I've not used it yet today, but this light green, this is a Pablo, so that's that green that you can see around here, that I was sort of testing with. So you can see those sort of circles where I'm doing that testing, and you might want to do that if you do if you're doing this in your own time, or are going to sort of redo this, or the next time you do something like this, having a few of these swatches where you're actually looking at the interaction of these different colours, and what's working well and what's not working not so well. Around this one, that was using the more purple colour as a bit of a halo. You can see that's almost giving it a darker effect. It's kind of pulling the poppy in on itself a little bit, whereas this one's almost brightening it up and giving it a bit of lightness. So if we go back to this one then, as we come down, I can be a little bit braver about the size and shape of these poppies. Again, it doesn't matter about getting it the same as that reference photo. It's about thinking about having this gradation in intensity of colour as we're coming forward, and the relative sizes, things getting closer to us. The other thing to think about when sort of dotting in these ones here at the front is whether I want any sort of flow through this, and that's more of a composition challenge for when you've been doing this a little bit longer. It's to think about whether we want them almost to go in a bit of a line, or to create almost a sea, a flow of these little poppies. I'll just pop a few more in, and then we can think about how we're going to do some of this green. Okay, so no right or wrong way to sort of pop in the green. I would probably start off with something quite light. So this is my khaki green. The grass here, or the stems here, aren't as big as the ones that we were looking at last week, so we can actually be quite quick with it. We're not worried about the details on here. I'm not even looking at the reference photo at the moment, to be honest. I'm just looking at the version that I did previously. I think if you do look at the reference photo, one thing that does stand out is the wind. So the wind is actually blowing the poppies. The wind is blowing the poppies this way. So if you have a look at it, or the stems are going this way, but the poppy heads are actually going that, pointing towards the sun, which is an interesting compositional challenge. Like, do you follow the reference photo and do both of those things, or maybe curve them around a little bit? You know, how do you approach that? It's almost like the poppies are fighting the wind, trying to get to the sunlight. That's what I remember from sort of being in there. Or you could just generally do some sort of stems kind of coming down. Now the issue with this is that now I've put that green in there, my brain, I'm sort of thinking, well, that's all the poppies then gone, because I can't put any more poppies in now, otherwise I'm going to end up with a bit of a poppy mess, because I'll have to go on top of that green. So if I did want any more in, I'm going to have to go in between those greens to get them nice and pure red looking. Otherwise we end up in that mucky territory there, even though it's a relatively pale green. So I would sort of spend your time thinking about where you want those poppies first. Can just about fit in a few others there. And then it's sort of circling through then and building up those colours, and it's the same approach, just on a slightly bigger scale. So I'm thinking actually here now I've got a mix of white surface that I can still see, some red and a bit of green. and it's very sketchy. It's not much of anything really. So I might come in with my yellow and just layer on top of the poppies a little bit, softening off the tops a little bit, light pressure, and immediately I've brought them to life a little bit. And now I've got 3 colours in this area, which feels a little bit better. I'm being quite sketchy with it. You can see I'm being, you can be quite quick. You can quite quick with it. And then I might think, well, I could, because these poppies are a little bit bigger, I could bring in another colour. So I could bring in another colour on top, and then I've got 3 colours on top of this poppy. I've got a nice mix then of sort of a darker red and a more orangey red, and then a yellowy colour. So that's something to have a play with, and then back and forward, especially with some of these big ones at the front. And I think if you spend your time on a few of them at the front, it does pay dividends, and then it sort of screams out poppies for the rest of it. So the other thing with the poppies that we've not talked about yet is their little heads. So we can see, if we zoom into them, that kind of classic dark centre to some of these poppies. So having that on some of them is going to be quite, it's going to be quite nice. We've got these little seed pods, and we've got so if we were doing really detailed work, we could bring in some of these sort of bent ones, which would be really nice. Some of the big leaves as well. There's all sorts of things that you could bring in if you wanted to. So what I did is I was a little bit selective in this one here. So I brought in the suggestion of some of those seed pods just with a dark chrome oxide green or something like that. I did test out, you might be able to see on there, I tested out putting some white in first, almost indenting the surface, not quite, putting a white in first, and then that's capturing some of these little reflections you can see. So I was just trying to get some of these reflections in there. It worked a little bit. I don't think it is necessarily worth an awful lot of effort, but it was worth having a play with. The other thing you can play with that would be to bring in some tape, lift it out with tape, or a little Stanley knife. If you've got a few layers on, you just want to scrape the top of the pigment off if you wanted those sorts of details then. But the key, I think, is going to be to get in some of those darker blobs. So for the darker blobs, actually, the chrome oxide green on top of that red would work okay. I think a black is probably too strong. I might go with a dark sepia or a charcoal grey or something like that instead. The trouble is black, that it will be the first thing that you see when you look at it. So if we pop in just a little bit, so the charcoal grey is very similar to a dark sepia. Just pop in a few heads on some of those. I don't even need it on all of them. Do a couple for now. I'm going to imagine that one's facing the other way. So I'm just doing sort of a sketchy blob. So I'm not doing a perfectly round circle. I'm keeping it quite loose and sketchy. Now once those have gone in, we need to be quite careful when we're working around it, that we're not dragging that black or that dark colour everywhere. So we can come back in and just be quite careful. where we're sort of dragging that. We could put in some of those sort of head shapes. So the sort of seed pod shape is something that looks, so it's going to look a little bit like that, and obviously we're doing it like 1/100th of that size, so a little cup I think is all we need, almost like a little V is all we need for some of those. So we could put in a few of those, or we could do that right at the end. And then I said we could try dotting in some white for some of those, like the reflections on that. So I'm using a hard pressure for this. So it's not a sharp pencil, but it's got a bit of a point to it because of the way I've sort of used it to sort of shade in. Trouble is with a sharp point, it's going to probably going to break off. But I could try adding a bit of hard pressure in. Again, this is an experiment piece, so just have a bit of a play with it. So we'll pop some of those in, and then we're just building up then some of the grasses. So this is a permanent green olive and polychromos. It's skipping over some of that khaki green that I've got down, which is nice. I didn't use a hard pressure, but with the polychromos being quite a hard pencil, I can use it in quite a light, sort of sketchy way. I'm avoiding those reds, and I am trying to go in between some of the khaki green if I can. Have a play around with the pressure that you use when you're doing some of these grasses as well. Don't be afraid to use hard pressure to give you that little bit of a resist, so that the other pencils will skip over it a little bit, but I would reserve that for when you're confident that you know that you've, for example, got in enough red poppies. I'm not sure I've got in all the red poppies that I want. I might pop in a few more in there, but I've got to be careful, as I say, that I'm not going on top of those green areas, only in the gaps. And then we're just sort of circling through then, increasing. So I've gone through some different greens, started off with this one, so that's for some of these stems down here. Started off with a khaki green, got a slightly darker green, and then an even darker one. I'm just sort of circling through those then. With the darker ones, I'm tending to leave some of those foreground stems a bit. So with the darker ones, it's almost like I'm drawing the stems behind the ones that I'm interested in, rather than the stems themselves. It's a way to sort of think about it, that kind of negative drawing approach. So if we come down here, for example, these are my stems, and I put them in with my khaki green, for example. What I've next done, I went in with my permanent green, and I kind of went next to them. Sometimes I skipped over them. By the time I'm getting to my darker green, then what I'm doing is I'm deliberately skipping, drawing, leaving some of the palest bits. So there's a lot more sort of triangle shapes and things like that with the darker green, just so that it feels like you're drawing the depths of those greens in there. And the more you practice this, the more you can be a little bit quicker with it. I wouldn't be too concerned. I did that very carefully down here. You only need to be careful right in the foreground. For the rest of it, it's just enough of a suggestion to have some variety in those colours. You can see move really rapidly when we get a bit further back, and I can even put some of that right at the back there on those ones there. But then when I come down to the foreground here, I might slow down a little bit. And as I said right at the beginning, it's easier almost when you do it slightly bigger, because you're able to go a little bit slower and draw around things a little bit quicker. So I've still got some white areas around my poppies. So I'm just going to blend those a little bit. And actually this, I've picked up now, Naples yellow, that's working quite well even in these greeny areas. So what I might do is actually create a few sort of banks of those a little bit. Talked about having those washes of colour, so I've got my cream back again, and actually I'm coming down halfway down this one there now, and I'm just giving everything a bit of a glaze of colour. So I've come almost halfway down that field. I've lost some of the green and I've lost some of my poppies, so I'm going to go back in with a red, pick up those poppies again. This time, if you want to join a few of them together, you can do. Just make sure that, yeah, as I say, we're not going into those greeny areas. But we can go right up to those green areas, as long as we don't go into them. So it feels that some of these heads could be a bit bigger on some of them, and then actually I want some of them a little bit darker, so I've swapped again to a different red, put those in, and it's just sort of circling around then. So we've got all of the techniques then now. There's no other sort of secret ways of finishing this off or other techniques that to bring in. Everything that you need to finish this little poppy field, I've talked about, even if you've not been able to carry on with me then. It's just circling through and getting having a bit of a play, getting the feel for that field. The other things that you might want to think about, so if we look at this one, why is this one different? It's different because I've varied the greens. So I've still used the same colours, but I've varied where I've got some of the darker shades, left a few pockets of the brighter colours coming through. Looking at this, I might have used a slightly lighter green. You could bring in something with a bit more of a pop, like a spring green on some of these areas as well. But it has this kind of depth to the field that we see in this reference photo, because I've picked out these blocks of darker green. So that's where the realism is then going to come, is adapting those techniques a little bit as we move across the field. So let's take that example. So let's take an example for it. Let's say here, and we're just going to make all of this area a little bit darker. So I'm not touching my red, I'm just darkening that area off a little bit, and then maybe over in this area a little bit. That's a bit darker over there, and then okay, let's go through here a little bit darker. Bearing in mind, if I do this too much, then it negates the whole thing, because then we've got everything looking the same again. Okay, so I've got a bit more variation then on there, and then you could have a play around with the effect of some of these other colours in there. So what happens if we put in a bit of a purple, actually bringing in, I've spoken about this before, bringing in a colour in multiple places across the piece is going to harmonise it as well. So it doesn't mean the same colour has to be everywhere, but for example, if I've got this nice ultramarine violet purpley tone at the back here, actually having it in some of the shadows, some of the as almost one of these glazing pencils. It's almost like how I'm using it down here, or having it a few dots maybe in the, as some of those wildfire flowers as well. It's going to just bring everything together a little bit. So this is the time to have a little bit of a play with it. Bring some of those other colours in. Remember that purple is going to sit quite nicely with the red and the green. It goes really nicely with the yellow. I'm running out of places to do. So that's my purple over there. So if I've got my yellowy colour coming across there, it's just going to give me a bit of a darker yellow. Again, it's a kind of complementary colour, but it's just going to darken off that yellow a little bit. So if you've gone a little bit too vibrant with the yellow, actually bringing in some of the purpley tones is quite useful. With the sort of idea of smoothing everything down, we talked about that as well. So if I go over again, it can be a bit of a backwards and forwards. We want to smooth those back layers as well, soften everything just a little bit, because that's what happens in the distance. It's actually, the effect is sort of blurring our focus, so you could have a play around with that. And then it becomes a little bit of a dance, because at that point then you've lost your definition of your poppies again. So you might want to come back in and just do a few more sort of circly bits. Play around with your pressure. I would say always start light pressure and then just increase it just a little bit so that you get an effect, so that you get it either, in the case of the smoothing, you want it to just soften, just become a little bit duller, less vibrant is what we're looking for. We're not looking for burnishing so that you can't do anything else with it. We're still playing around with it, and just play around with some of these reds as well. If the reds aren't giving you enough pop, then you can come in and with a little bit of yellow, and just sort of keep circling through then. Does anyone have any questions? Otherwise, I'm just going to sit here and do some more
grasses for the last few minutes, so I'm just trying to fill in some of the gaps really. I've not got any white paper left. Doing in those sort of grasses, you can see that I'm not looking at the reference photo, and I'm not working really carefully and drawing each individual blade. I'm going in and I'm just sort of going generally up and down, varying it a little bit, being quite sketchy. I don't mind if it looks a bit of a mess in those intermediate stages. I'm just getting some new layers down, and I think that would be one of my keys with the grasses, is to find your own way of making it as enjoyable as and easy as possible. And for me, it's that kind of thing of, okay, I'm just going to whack something in quite quickly, and then you look at it and then you think, well, actually I've got some nice shapes in there. I'm just going to fill those in, and then it becomes more of an intuitive approach after there. Question in the chat, you mentioned something about rescue techniques. I think really we've done our best to avoid a lot of those things. I think the what we're trying to do, rather than necessarily fix things, is just adapt to things as we're going along. So one of the pitfalls really to avoid falling into is this green red mucky mix. So we've talked about avoiding that. I think the other way of avoiding things is to go really slowly. So going really slowly with your layers, and then you can always lift out. So I wonder so if anyone can brainstorm any problems for me, I can attempt some solutions. I think one of the things that, is quite common is you might end up with, a mark across your page. That might be one thing that you get. So maybe we've got some dramatic marks. You've scuffed your paper. I think it becomes a case of sort of lifting some of it out, not panicking about it, and then just sort of adapting things. So you can see I can lift out those early layers really well with a putty eraser. This varies slightly on the different surfaces, but you can certainly lift out some of it. So I've lifted out most of it there, and then you just sort of adapt your drawing a little bit to incorporate some of those changes, and then come back in again. You can fade it off a little bit. So with these dramatic marks, for example, what I'd probably do is make it into more of a dramatic shadow, this whole area a little bit. So just try and get rid of that really dark line there going all the way through, and then maybe we'd have something that sort of embraces having a darker patch over here. Would be one way to sort of bring that in, and then that's lessened it certainly. We're not going to get rid of all of that colour in there, but we can go on that clear paper, any clear paper we've got left, we can pop in some of those reds. I think if you have got those kind of mucky greeny colours, what I would probably do is try and lift out as much of that colour as possible, and I would accept that you're not going to go back to the red. So let's get a mucky. Okay, so we've got a mucky poppy here. You can see how that's not ideal for our poppies. With something like that kind of area that I've got there, if I'm using the putty eraser, and you saw me using the putty eraser on this side over here, it removes quite a large area. I would probably go in with some tape to remove this. So that's tape. And I try and take out as much of that browny area as possible. And it's just sort of lightened it. It's still there. Again, that is, in my opinion, that's never going to go back to a nice bright red poppy. You're never going to get the nice vibrant yellow undertones that you have up here, for example. Even if I went in with a red here now, I think we just accept that that is no longer a poppy, and we just blend that in with the grasses and it will just disappear and nobody will know it's there. The number one piece of advice really I've got for those sorts of errors or mistakes is, one, not to panic. Nobody else is going to spot it. Nobody else is going to know it's there when it's finished other than you. And to almost embrace it as a bit of a learning opportunity. I wouldn't normally do a huge streak across my page by choice, so that I learnt something from it. But if it does happen, you are going to really develop your techniques by having that in there. You can see one of those lines that I made earlier is virtually gone, and now we've just got one piece up here, and then we might even adapt that and sort of have, we could even make it a little wild grass or something like that. We could change it slightly. So we've got a bit of a branch or something in there, so we can always sort of work with that. Generally, I'd say normally, and with the grasses, you come brighter and more vibrant as you come closer to us. So I'd probably pop in some, and we can see some bright, vibrant bits in the reference photo as well. But having some variation, certainly in this piece, is helping with that realism. So this is a spring green, and I'm using a relatively hard pressure, and I'm just filling in some of those little gaps and avoiding the reds. I'm just giving it a bit of a pop in some areas. Okay. Anyone else got any questions? I think I've given you a lot of information, and again, you can see the extent of all these scribbles, the amounts of different techniques and little things to think about that we've covered. Please don't feel overwhelmed with it.
Battery exhausted, 9 o'clock in the UK. We're all exhausted. We're all pencils down, everyone. Yeah, it's a bit hot here. The camera's had enough for tonight, so I think that's a good place to stop. I don't think there are any more questions that have come in, but if you do think of anything, do pop me an email and I can do a little bit of a wrap up. I'll do a blog, some sort of step-by-step photos and things to wrap up this little series anyway. So there'll be a perfect opportunity to ask any of the follow-up questions and get some answers from me. Do continue to send me your little pieces. I've loved seeing them, and have an absolutely lovely weekend. Yeah, lovely weekend, everyone. Thank you for joining me on a Friday evening. It's been absolutely lovely. Thank you, Louise. Yeah, anyone just joining, I've been battling a really bad cold flu thing this week, but I'm on the mend. On the mend. Voice just keeps coming and going. But thanks very much, everyone. Have a lovely weekend, and yeah, I look forward to hearing from you. Bye.